Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
My pleasure to welcome back to the show my guy Spero Dedes. Last time he was on as TNT NBA play-by-play man. Now CBS NFL play-by-play man. The fantastic double that he does. He's got the Commanders this weekend in Denver. Spero, welcome back to the show, man.
Craig, good to hear your voice and good to be back. Things have changed with this franchise since the last time we spoke.
No doubt. And ironically, though, I do think the last time you were on, we had you on when you were calling Phoenix Denver. That just hit me. So the fact that you're going to be back in Denver this weekend, apparently every time you go, you wind up on the show.
I am your Denver beat reporter.
Who would have thought?
It's an honor. It's an honor.
So when you see this team from the outside, and you kind of take this, you come in for the weekend, and that's what you guys do on the national play-by-play front, and you interact with the team. I know at this point of the week, it's not been as much, especially for a road team. You won't really get to see them until the weekend, but just what you're hearing, what the vibe is, what the buzz is around the league compared to what it has been previously. Like, how different is the experience, even to a Thursday in a game week for you?
Yeah, night and day getting ready for this team. And we've done a good number of Washington games over the past couple of years, going back to Ron's first year there. And I always got the sense that you were just kind of walking on eggshells in that building. There was a tension. There was just always something bubbling beneath the surface. And we have the privilege of going to facilities around the NFL, and it's so different from team to team, from franchise to franchise. The operations that are perennially in a good place at the top of the league, the vibe in those buildings is so different. And just to take my broadcaster hat on and just to speak from a fan's perspective, I grew up in the Northeast. I was a Giants fan growing up. I mean, to me, the Washington franchise was synonymous with success and first class and all of the good things that you strive to be as an NFL franchise. And for that to go away for as long as it did, I just, obviously it sucked if you were a fan of the franchise. But just from afar, the league is better when Washington is in its usual perch. I grew up watching the Joe Gibbs teams and, the Hogs and Darryl Green and just Hall of Fame players and just a first-class organization. So I think the fact that they've turned that corner and that black cloud is no longer hanging above this franchise, this is a season, no matter what the win-loss record is at the end, that, if you're a fan of the Commanders, if you've been a fan of this franchise for a long time, just enjoy this moment. And then, you have to put your faith in the front office now that over the next year, 2-3 years, they're going to make the decisions to get this team to continue its climb up the NFC.
So one of the things that you mentioned Ron kind of being on eggshells and people around the building being on eggshells. He obviously had to cover for so much, and it's always an interesting conversation around here with him because there's certainly like generic run-of-the-mill head coach criticism. Then there's also in the back of your mind, you're like, oh yeah, he had cancer and he's had to deal with this terrible owner and the DEA raided the facility. Like, there's been all this nonsense that he's had to deal with. But
gosh, I forgot about that.
Yeah, I actually did too, till the other day, till Fitzpatrick brought it up with Kevin Clark on his show. And I was like, oh, right, they got raided by the DEA and didn't have trainers for half the year.
Yeah.
But when you I don't know if you had the chance to talk to him about Howell yet at all, or what you anticipate, but when you talked to him last year about Carson, and we had this conversation with Adam Amin, who called the game for Fox Week 1 last week, and he said the conversation about Howell versus the conversation about Wentz was completely different. That with Wentz, it was like Ron was saying all the right things, but if you read his body language, like there was clearly nerves there. And again, I don't know how much you've had a chance to talk to them at all this week, but I'm curious if you remember any conversations last year with Ron about Wentz, and then kind of, mentally preparing what it'll be like to talk to him about Howell and what you've seen in terms of press clippings, et cetera, press conferences throughout the spring and summer about this year's quarterback.
Yeah, we haven't met with them yet. We're going to sit down with them at their hotel once they get into Denver on Saturday, and we're all looking forward to that. And I'm just looking forward to seeing what his demeanor's like. And obviously, we've been listening to his press conferences and following the team from afar. But I can't speak to we had Washington, I want to say early last year. Can't remember exactly which week, but you did get the sense that very early in that marriage between Wentz and the franchise, that they got the feeling very quickly that he was not going to be the answer. And some of that was based on track record. Obviously, his status, his stock had fallen to such an incredibly low point to where the margin for error for Carson Wentz just was very, very small. And Ron is a loyal guy. He's been through a ton in his personal life, as you just alluded to. And the one thing you love about him is that he's always going to go to bat for his guys. Whether he believes that deep down, only he can answer that. But I don't think there's any doubt that early last year, they kind of got the feeling that it just wasn't going to work out. And they were stuck in this no man's land of searching for a quarterback and somewhere that the franchise has been for a very long time, basically since Kirk Cousins walked out the door. So completely different vibe now with this kid. I think they just made an organizational decision after swinging for the fences a little bit the last couple of years. Obviously, there was some interest in Russell Wilson. Great story today in the Washington Post. A couple of years ago, Ryan Fitzpatrick worked a little bit, then the injuries. Now they've made the decision, we're going to invest in a kid that we drafted, a pretty good value pick for a fifth rounder, based on what he did his second year at North Carolina. And I think they're all in on this kid. And this is, from a fan's perspective, if I'm a fan of the team, this is what I want. You've got a very motivated offensive coordinator, associate head coach in Eric Bieniemy, who we all know has a ton to prove, clearly wants to be a head coach in this league. And he knows that if he can get this kid, Sam Howell, to perform at a level that puts Washington in postseason contention this year, automatically he's in the mix potentially for a head job next year and certainly within the next couple of years. So you've got a motivated staff. You've got a kid who's got some nice traits. And now let's see how far they can take this thing together.
Spero Dedes, CBS, with us. He'll be on the call this weekend. Commanders and Broncos kickoff is at 4:25. Set your reminders accordingly. He's with us, of course, for Not My Beat today. So you mentioned Bieniemy. I'm sure at some point over the last, I don't know, he was there for a decade. You've been calling games a long time. You had to have had him at least a couple of times over the years when he was the OC and had a chance to meet with him. What's always kind of your conversation like with Bieniemy, and what can you tell us about what he's like behind closed doors?
Love talking to him. He's such a football guy. He's so bright. But he just, he's one of those guys that has the chip on his shoulder. And I think as the last couple of years have materialized, and he thought he was going to, he was the darling kind of coaching candidate, and to be sitting here in 2023 and he still hasn't gotten that opportunity, you can imagine, the size of that chip only gets bigger. And so, we've always enjoyed chatting with him, but I do think that this is now his shot. I mean, there's nowhere else to hide. If he can, he's the play caller. I know he hasn't appreciated some of the line of questioning of the fact that is he calling plays for the first time. He clearly stated that he has and did for certain stretches in Kansas City. But be that as it may, this is now his show. And everyone knows that he's the guy. He has taken the reins of this offense. And, he doesn't have Patrick Mahomes anymore. He doesn't have Andy Reid next to him anymore. Let's see what you can do now. And I think the competitor in Eric Bieniemy likes this. Would he like to be a head coach in 2023? Absolutely. But this is the reality of the situation. I think it's a really good opportunity for him to prove to the league and to prove to the owners who have passed him over for jobs that he is indeed worthy of a head job at some point. And this is what you love about sports. I mean, there's no excuses anymore. Let's see what you can do with a kid who, again, fifth round pick, isn't, top high draft pick, does have some shortcomings. Can you mold this kid to perform at a level that gives your team a chance at the playoffs, that gives your team a chance at a division championship? That's what we're going to find out here over the next couple of weeks and next few months.
I want to circle back to some of the bigger, more obvious storylines with Denver in a second. But if I'm not mistaken, your broadcast partner's Adam Archuleta, right? Mm-hmm. Have that correct. He was pretty good as a safety back in the day. And you guys have had Denver before, and I'm sure he's had a chance. You guys have had a chance to talk about Justin Simmons, and that's a name that we haven't mentioned probably enough on the show this week. I guess we're kind of really starting our Denver stuff today, but that guy is ridiculously good. And he's a name because he plays in Denver that I don't know that everybody knows. But as you talk with Adam and observe yourself, what Justin Simmons means to that defense, what kind of challenge does he present for Bieniemy, Howell, and this Commanders offense?
Well, I think I couldn't agree with you more. I think he's one of the more underrated players at his position. The guy's been an all-pro, not just a Pro Bowl, but an all-pro each of the last 3 years. I mean, the guys at that position that have done that are few and far between. So in and of himself, I think he's an elite talent. Now suddenly you put him in the same defensive backfield as a kid like Pat Surtain, and suddenly he goes to an even higher level. Justin Simmons and Surtain, that's a pretty good cornerback duo. And, now suddenly you got to stay away from Surtain. And so Simmons last year, I thought took advantage of it and then some, career high 6 interceptions, I think tied him for the league lead last year. And, he's just one of those guys that is so versatile. He's got a great frame at his position. And Arch loves those kind of players, that have the long arms and rangy guys that can cover a ton of distance. And, it's another reason why I think, all the conversation in Denver has been about Sean Payton. Can he get Russell Wilson right? That defense, I think, if they can figure out the pass rush, which is a little bit of an issue for them, they've got some pieces back there. And they're one of those teams that can go from the bottom to potential contention in the span of a year very quickly if they can figure some things out on both sides of the ball. But Simmons, I couldn't agree more. One of the best at his position and very, very underrated.
Then you get to kind of the obvious stories. Spero Dedes is our guest. CBS Sports play-by-play man will be on the call this weekend. And I'm curious, as you even put together kind of your storyboard for the game, the headliney type of stuff, how much do you talk about the Russell Wilson Washington connection and that article that Sam Fortier wrote in the Washington Post, and that they tried to go after him? That Sean Payton has made some comments about, there was an ownership group that is potentially getting involved, and everyone was pretty sure that it was the Josh Harris group that had talked to him while he was still at Fox, and Ron Rivera had to answer those comments. Do any of those kind of, I don't want to lead the witness and call them ancillary, but do any of those storylines make the broadcast prep, if you will?
I think potentially. And look, Russell Wilson was the number one quarterback on the market. So, this narrative that, it was a bad thing or it's some kind of slight to Sam Howell or anyone else within the Washington franchise, I think is silly. I mean, obviously they had an interest in Russell Wilson, didn't work out. He had a short list of teams that he was interested in going, had his no trade clause, and he ended up in Denver. But as it was alluded to in that piece today, I think based on what happened last year with Russell Wilson in Denver and based on the draft capital and the King's ransom that they had to give up to get Wilson, I don't think I'm very upset with where I'm at if I'm a fan of the Commanders, based on what they did with those picks that they were able to keep and based on some of the potential that I think you see with Sam Howell. Now, it's obviously very early. We don't know who this kid is, what his ceiling is as a quarterback. But for a franchise that had so many holes and so many needs, I'm never a fan of giving up so much in terms of draft capital in the NFL. Those picks are so valuable. And, now that's why I think you make the big bet on an Eric Bieniemy to come in and to mold this kid, because if you can get out of him some of what you were hoping to get out of a Russell Wilson and a guy of his ilk at the quarterback position, then you've really got something. So, it was a gamble that I think they made as a franchise, and now we'll have to wait and see. But certainly it's a storyline. We've got a Didi Kinkabwala who's as well connected in this league as anyone. She's talking to all the executives this week and the coaches, and I'm sure we'll have some of those storylines during the course of the game.
Yeah, I would go as far as to say that even if Sam doesn't work out, not having given up that draft capital is probably the best outcome for Washington, considering where Russ is. And you trust Bieniemy to pick, assuming that everyone doesn't get blown out after the year, with which new ownership, who knows? You trust Bieniemy to pick the next guy, or whoever you hire to pick the next guy. And that's been kind of the, if you want a bonus storyline, Spero, just spoon feeding you here. Like, the thing that's been crazy about Washington with the quarterback stuff is they've never really had a coach quarterback alignment where, going back to Griffin is kind of forced upon them. Like the Shanahans wanted him. They didn't want to give up the price,
Sure.
but they also draft Cousins because they know like this is a pretty high risk deal. Then they get blown out. Gruden inherits Cousins. Cousins winds up leaving because of mess with the front office. Gruden then gets Haskins forced upon him. Gruden gets fired. Rivera comes in, has to try to play Dwayne for a year, and obviously that doesn't wind up working out. And obviously the tragedy has since happened with Dwayne, but from a pure football standpoint, like there's no alignment there. And so, you'd hope that eventually there's a coach and a quarterback that actually picked each other, so to speak, that could be developed here. But they have the chance to do that.
That's a great point. It's just a byproduct, I think, of organizational dysfunction. And when you've had a rotation, a carousel of head coaches and GMs and all the ownership issues that they've had there, it comes with the territory, unfortunately. But again, I think there's light at the end of the tunnel, and they didn't give up a ton to get this kid. 5th round pick. They're kind of playing with house money right now. And so I like where they are, especially after what we've seen there the last decade plus, who knows how many years.
Agreed. Last thing for you on the way out, and my long diatribe there actually just ticked this off in my brain, and we go full circle back to your NBA roots as well. I should have asked you about Josh Harris first. I'm going to ask you about Josh Harris last. Like, you've watched him work in Philadelphia as the owner of the 76ers. What do you take from his ownership in Philly and what he's done there that you think is applicable to what he will do with the football team here?
I don't think it's hard. I mean, I just think that the best owners, and look, we've seen the brash owners have success, the Jerry Joneses, all these guys that love the spotlight. But to me, I've always been a fan of the owner who spends the money, hires the right people, and just gets out of the way. Lets these people perform and do the job that they've been brought in to do. Doesn't meddle, isn't around day to day. I did like that he went down to the locker room last week in a really cool moment between him and Ron Rivera with the game ball. But you could just tell, and I've heard this talking to people around the 76ers, that, he's not a guy that loves the spotlight. He's a guy that you want to play for, you want to win for, and he just has all the attributes that you want. And I just think, look at all the alumni that showed up last week. Champ Bailey hasn't been there in 100 years, and RG3 and all of these guys. I think you're starting to see his impact on that franchise, on that city in a very short amount of time. And that's why if I'm a fan, the win-loss record is obviously something you want to win this year, but just to get out from under that cloud and to have Josh Harris as your owner, whatever happens this year, it's a success. He's the type of owner that you want.
No doubt. And that's certainly the way a lot of people here feel, although on game days, it doesn't always feel that way as people are watching irrationally on Twitter and yada, yada, yada. As we do, all of us watching from here in the district will be hearing the voice of this man right here, Spero Dedes, on CBS this weekend. Spero, always a pleasure to catch up, my friend. Hopefully we got you a game in DC later this season. We'll get a chance to catch up in person. Until then, stay well, travel safe, and thanks for coming on the show.
Always a pleasure, Craig. I appreciate it.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.